On the bend of the road, the steady hum of the engine was Jorge's soundtrack of solitude. At 58, he knew every twist and turn of the highway like the lines on his own hand. For decades, he had driven his interstate bus along nearly forgotten routes, connecting small towns and places where time seemed to move slower. Most passengers were just passing faces, quite literally. People came and went, exchanged only a few words, and then vanished in the rearview mirror of memory. Jorge had grown used to the silence. His tired eyes found comfort in the landscapes that rolled past the window, and his favorite company was the soft instrumental music that gently filled the bus. He no longer expected surprises. Life had become a predictable rhythm of boarding, disembarking, and nights spent at roadside gas stations. That morning, he left a little town called Serra Azul, with only 3 passengers. The journey to the capital would take nearly 10 hours. The sun was still stretching over the mountains when Jorge pulled over at a rest stop for a quick break. As he sipped a weak coffee from a styrofoam cup, he noticed a young man standing beside a large, worn-out backpack. Dressed in simple clothes, his tousled brown hair fell into his eyes, and his expression, though alert, carried a quiet, unsettled air. "Where you headed, kid?" Jorge asked, more out of habit than curiosity. The young man pointed at the bus sign and then gestured with his hands. Jorge furrowed his brow, trying to understand. The boy then pulled a small notebook from his pocket and wrote, "I'm deaf. Can you take me to the city?" Jorge was caught off guard, not by the request, but by the way it was made. He rarely met anyone who didn't respond with words. There was something in the young man's expression, a blend of restrained urgency and shy hope, that made Jorge nod without thinking too much. "Hop in," he said, opening the door. The boy smiled, in gratitude, revealing a chipped tooth, and climbed aboard with light steps. He sat in the back row, hugging his backpack. Jorge watched him in the rearview mirror for a moment before turning back to the wheel. The road waited, as silent and indifferent as always, but something felt different that day. A subtle shift, almost imperceptible, was beginning to stir Jorge's rigid routine. Over the next few hours, Jorge stole a few discreet glances at the new passenger. The young man kept his eyes on the scenery, occasionally scribbling in his notebook. Jorge found himself wondering about the story behind that silence. Was he running from something? Searching for someone? Or did he simply want to disappear for a while? They exchanged no words, but a strange connection slowly began to form between them, a kind of understanding that didn't rely on sounds or well-formed phrases. For the first time in years, Jorge felt that he wasn't completely alone in the driver's seat of his world, and he didn't know it yet. But that quiet encounter was about to change the course of his journey in a way no curve in the road ever dared to. Chapter 1: The Passenger Who Didn't Speak. The first hour of the trip passed in silence. Jorge kept his eyes on the road, while the other passengers either slept or stared at their phones. The young deaf man remained still, gazing out the window as the landscape flowed past like a forgotten movie reel. At the next rest stop, the other passengers stepped out for snacks or a cigarette. The young man stayed on the bus. Jorge, curious, brought him a bottle of water and a snack. The boy smiled and wrote on his notebook, "Thank you, my name is Lucas." Jorge nodded and replied, scribbling on a napkin, "Jorge, nice to meet you." From that point on, every break became a small opportunity to exchange a few written words. Lucas was quiet but observant. He drew sketches in his notebook. Trees, faces, even Jorge's bus. His talent was evident. The way he captured light and shadow spoke louder than anything his voice could have said. Jorge learned that Lucas was only 20, had lost his hearing due to a childhood illness, and was traveling alone to find his brother, who had recently moved to the city. They hadn't spoken in years. There was no promise of a reunion, only a letter, a last-known address, and a stubborn kind of hope. Jorge didn't say much about himself. But he let Lucas sit in the front seat during the next leg of the trip. It felt strange at first, having someone there, but not unpleasant. On one long stretch of highway, Jorge pointed at the sky. "Storm coming," he mouthed. Lucas looked, nodded, and drew the heavy clouds with pencil strokes that felt like thunder. When the rain hit, it came. Fast! The bus slowed. Visibility dropped. The windshield wipers danced in a frantic rhythm. Suddenly, on a particularly sharp curve, a blur of movement appeared ahead. Jorge slammed the brakes. A woman stood in the middle of the road, waving frantically. He stopped the bus just in time. She was soaked, trembling and crying. Her car had broken down around the bend. She begged for help. Her phone was dead and there was no signal. Jorge calmed her down and offered to call for help at the next stop. She hesitated, looked toward Lucas, and whispered, "He's deaf?" Jorge nodded. She said nothing more, just stared at the boy for a moment, as if she saw something familiar in his silence. The bus continued. Lucas offered the woman his jacket without a word. She accepted it, her hands shaking. That night the bus made its final stop in the city. The woman thanked Jorge quietly and disappeared into the crowd. Lucas stood near the luggage compartment, notebook in hand. He wrote, "Thanks for not treating me like a problem." Jorge placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and smiled. Lucas then handed him a folded paper. Inside was a sketch of the two of them in the bus, laughing, but Jorge didn't remember laughing. Lucas winked and disappeared into the city. Jorge watched the crowd for a long time before returning to his empty vehicle. Something had changed. He couldn't name it, but he felt it, in the silence that was no longer lonely. Chapter 2: The Unspoken Bond. The days passed, and Jorge continued his usual route, but something inside him had shifted. It was as if the road had suddenly taken on a different meaning, more than just a stretch of asphalt connecting places and faces. Now, every mile carried a weight he couldn't shake off. The memory of Lucas, the quiet young man who had shared a fleeting moment of connection, lingered like the fading scent of rain. Jorge often found himself thinking about their brief encounter, the way Lucas had drawn his world in that little notebook. He had never met anyone quite like him, someone who spoke so much without a single word, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes, one that Jorge couldn't quite decipher. Maybe it was the isolation, the silence, or the search for something, or someone that had driven him so far away from home. The weeks passed, and Jorge carried on, picking up and dropping off passengers. But Lucas's absence haunted him. He'd asked a few of the bus drivers at the terminal about the young man, but no one seemed to know anything. Jorge had come to realize that he didn't need to know the details of Lucas's life. The connection was real, even if it was formed without words. Then, one rainy afternoon, as Jorge was about to leave the terminal for his next trip, a familiar face appeared at the bus station. It was Lucas, standing just outside the door, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The moment their eyes met, a silent understanding passed between them. Without a word, Jorge opened the door, and Lucas climbed aboard, just as he had done weeks earlier. This time, however, the bus was not as quiet as before. The other passengers noticed the young man's presence, and curiosity buzzed in the air. Jorge noticed the way Lucas held his head high, his confidence a bit stronger than it had been before. He had changed somehow, just like Jorge had. As the bus rumbled back onto the road, the two of them sat in silence, but it was different now. It was as if their bond had been silently acknowledged, a connection that needed no explanation. The rain beat down on the windows, creating a rhythmic backdrop to their quiet companionship. At one of the stops, a man boarded the bus with a large suitcase, his voice loud and obnoxious as he complained about the weather. He immediately noticed Lucas sitting in the front row and shot him a strange look. "What's he doing here?" the man muttered under his breath, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Shouldn't he be in some sort of special place?" Jorge's grip heightened on the wheel. His heart raced, not because of the man's words, but because of the look he saw on Lucas's face. There was no anger in the young man's eyes, just a quiet resignation. He had heard this before. Jorge glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his voice steady but firm as he said, "He's traveling like the rest of us. That's all that matters." The bus fell into an uncomfortable silence. The man didn't say another word, but the tension lingered in the air. Lucas, however, seemed unbothered. He took out his notebook and began drawing once again. The man remained on the bus for a few more hours, but the atmosphere had shifted. The other passengers were no longer focused on Lucas's silence. They were preoccupied with their own lives, their own worries. And in that moment, Lucas was just another person, just like them. When the journey came to an end, the bus rolled into the city terminal. Lucas stood up, ready to leave. But before stepping off, he walked over to Jorge, handing him a small folded piece of paper. Jorge unfolded it carefully, his fingers trembling slightly. It was another drawing, this one of him, the bus, and the road stretching into the horizon. But at the bottom of the drawing, Lucas had written, "Thank you for seeing me." Jorge didn't need to say anything. He simply nodded and watched as Lucas disappeared into the crowd once again. As the bus doors closed behind him, Jorge sat there for a moment, the weight of the day's events pressing on him. The road, the people, the silence. It all felt different. Now, Jorge realized that perhaps the real journey wasn't the miles he traveled, but the people he met along the way. It was the moments of connection, the silent exchanges that made the journey worthwhile, and in that silence, Jorge found his own understanding. The road might never be quiet again, but that was okay. He wasn't alone. Reflection. Sometimes we believe that the loudest voices are the ones that matter most, but in reality, it is the quiet moments, the unspoken connections, that often leave the deepest impact. Jorge's journey wasn't just one of miles traveled, but of understanding and acceptance. He learned that people communicate in more ways than just words. They communicate through actions, through silence, through shared experiences. Lucas, in his silence, taught Jorge a valuable lesson, that we are all more than the labels that others place on us. We are not defined by what we lack, but by what we offer. And it's in the small acts of kindness, the quiet gestures, where true connections are formed. The road ahead may be long, and the world may seem full of noise, but it is the silent moments of connection that make the journey worthwhile. Enjoyed this story? Then subscribe to the Golden Words channel so you won't miss any others. Every day, we bring you touching and emotional stories. Leave a comment with the city and country you're listening from. Let's spread these stories worldwide.